I lived with Richard for over 40 years, a marriage I believed was unshakable, until the day he passed away suddenly. 6 months later, a strange box appeared at my doorstep. Inside was a gift and a letter from a woman I'd never met, yet who knew far too much about my husband. That letter upended everything I thought I knew and forever changed how I view love, betrayal, and forgiveness. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old, living alone in a small town in Oregon. This house was once my home with Richard, my husband, the father of our two children, and the man I thought would be faithful until his last day. We met in our early 20s at a friend's small gathering. He was tall, with a gentle smile and eyes that always seemed to hide something. We fell in love the old-fashioned way, handwritten letters, dates at cozy cafes, and marriage after nearly 2 years of courtship. Richard was a calm, kind, and somewhat reserved man. He worked in the electric utility industry for 30 years before retiring early due to diabetes. I was a nurse, then became a full-time homemaker when our children were young. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Perhaps because I was so accustomed to our steady routine, I never asked, was he happy? I was. At least I thought I was. We have two children, Eleanor and Patrick. Both are grown, married, and living in other states. We video call weekly, share photos of the grandkids, and chat about gardening or recipes. When Richard died, they both flew home immediately. The funeral was simple but warm, attended by old friends, neighbors, and a few of Richard's former colleagues. I remember that night vividly. After everyone left, sitting alone in the living room, clutching his favorite shirt. The room felt empty, though the furniture hadn't moved. It was Richard's warmth that was gone. The first weeks after his death, I moved like a machine, waking early, brewing coffee, watering plants, eating breakfast, reading the paper, but everything felt tasteless. I kept telling myself, be strong. He wouldn't want you to fall apart. Yet deep down, I felt a part of me had died with him. Each night I'd stare at his empty armchair and think of the thousands of evenings we spent watching movies, debating politics, or simply sitting in silence together. Richard wasn't a romantic. He didn't bring flowers on Valentine's Day or write heartfelt birthday cards, but he always remembered. I preferred apple pie over cake. He did the dishes when my back ached. He held me silently when I cried after losing my mother. Those things, I thought, were true love. Not flashy, but enduring. I once told Eleanor, marriage is about the little things, repeated every day. If someone chooses to stay through all those little things, you're lucky. And I believed it. Believed Richard was the one who stayed. Until that cold February morning when I stepped onto the porch to grab the newspaper and found a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper, no return address. I assumed it was a belated gift from Eleanor or Patrick. But inside was a navy mule knitted scarf, crafted with care. Beneath it, a letter folded in thirds, written in soft, slanted handwriting. From the first line, I knew my life would never be the same. I stared at the box in my hand, my heart beating faster than usual. The navy moon scarf was neatly folded, as if someone had poured their heart into every stitch. I lifted the small card tucked beneath the fabric. No greeting, no sender's name, just a folded piece of paper, handwritten in blue ink. I sat down, my palms sweating despite the freezing air. I slowly opened the letter, each line blurring in my disoriented gaze. The first sentence stopped me cold. If you're reading this, then Richard is likely gone. I paused to take a deep breath. The name Richard in a stranger's handwriting carried an eerie mix of familiarity and distance, as if they knew a version of him I'd never met. I kept reading. My name is Claire. I know you don't know me, and I don't expect your forgiveness for intruding, but please give me a chance to share what I've carried in my heart for years. The ground beneath me seemed to shift. Claire? Who was Claire? Why did she know Richard? And why was she sending me this gift after he was gone? The letter continued. I met Richard nearly 4 years ago at an evening painting class in Salem. I was a beginner. He was just tagging along with a friend to pass the time. We chatted during a break, and the next class we ended up sitting together again. He kept coming back, saying he liked the calm atmosphere, but I believe it was because we found comfort in each other's company. I dropped the letter, feeling as if I'd been slapped. Richard never mentioned a painting class. He used to call art a waste of time. Yet, for nearly 4 years of his final days, he had a routine I knew nothing about. A woman I'd never heard of, never seen, who knew my husband well enough to write these intimate details. My hands trembled as I picked up the letter again. We didn't start with bad intentions, we just talked, shared little pieces of our lives. I knew he was married, he never hid that. And because of it, I felt safe. No expectations, no strings. We were just two lonely people finding a bit of warmth in each other. I didn't know what I felt then. Anger? Yes. Confusion? Overwhelmingly. But what shocked me most was I believed her. Something in her handwriting, her tone, told me this wasn't a cruel prank or jealous spite. This was a confession from someone who had loved, quietly. Claire wrote that Richard often spoke of me, always with respect and gratitude in his eyes. He never intended to leave me, she wrote. You were his family, his real life. I never hoped he'd choose me. I just knew that in our weakest moments, we shared something deeply real. I set the letter down, tears falling without my notice. All through our marriage, I thought Richard's reserve was just his nature. I never pushed him to share his feelings, never asked, "Are you lonely?" I assumed his silence meant contentment. And maybe that was my mistake. Not to blame myself, but a truth I had to face. There were parts of Richard I never saw, not because he hid them, but because I never looked. The letter ended with a thank you, not for forgiveness, but for reading to the end. I'm sending you this scarf. Richard once said you get cold shoulders when you sleep. I hope this small gift can warm you in the days ahead, as he would have. Please don't hate me. I didn't take anything from you. I just loved him in the only way I knew. I gripped the scarf tightly. The wool was soft, warm, with a faint lavender scent. I stared out the window as snowflakes began to fall. I thought I'd be furious, tear the letter to shreds, toss the scarf into the fireplace. But instead, I sat. For a long time, so long that daylight faded into a gray, silent afternoon. I didn't know what hurt more, that he'd betrayed me, or that a part of him never belonged to me. And now I'd never have the chance to understand it. That night, I sat alone at the dining table, the scarf laid out before me, Claire's letter still open. I couldn't eat. My fingers traced her words, searching for a loophole, an explanation, a way to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. But the more I reread, the clearer it became. This wasn't fiction. Richard, the man I'd loved for nearly my entire life, had shared a deep connection with another woman in his final years. I didn't know what to call it. An affair? Claire said they never crossed physical boundaries. A profound friendship? Maybe. But isn't the deepest betrayal in the heart? Not just the body? I started recalling all the evenings Richard came home late, the days he said he needed to get some air. I remembered how he'd smile when answering a call, shielding the screen from me. I'd brushed off those signs, thinking it was just a retired husband's need for space. Now I wondered, did I choose not to see? The next morning I woke earlier than usual, my eyes swollen from a near sleepless night. I brewed coffee, grabbed a blank sheet of paper, and began writing. Not to Claire, but for myself. to make sense of the storm inside me. I wrote about my anger, the double loss of my husband, and the image I trusted for 4 decades. I wrote about feeling left out of a world I should have known best. Then I folded the paper without rereading it and tucked it into a drawer. I wasn't sure I'd ever open it again. But I needed to write it to admit my heart was breaking. The days that followed dragged on as if time itself slowed to torture me. Richard began appearing in my mind differently, not as the flawless husband in the portrait on the wall, but as a real person, complex, conflicted, and deeply lonely. I recalled an afternoon a few years back when I told him I no longer felt like traveling. I just wanted to stay home, tend my flowers, and read. Richard nodded, smiled faintly, and said, "As long as you're at peace." But now I wondered, what about him? Was he at peace, stuck at home, watching me retreat into old routines? Was that when he started searching for something else? I didn't fully blame Richard, but I couldn't forgive him easily either. The hardest part wasn't the pain, it was the contradiction. Love versus betrayal. Beautiful memories versus harsh reality. I felt torn in two. One part still loved him fiercely. The other resented him for sharing his heart with someone else. A week later, Eleanor called. She asked if I was okay, and I said, "I'm fine. Don't worry." I couldn't tell her. I feared that if I did, her image of her father would shatter. I didn't want Richard's legacy and our children's hearts tainted by his mistakes. That was the one thing I still wanted to protect for him, even if he hadn't done the same for me. One afternoon, I decided to drive. I took Claire's scarf and led her with me. I didn't know what I was doing, just that I needed to leave the house. I drove to the park by the lake, where Richard and I used to walk hand in hand when we were young. I sat on our familiar bench, staring at the still water. Everything was so quiet I could hear the leaves fall. I pulled out the letter and read it again. This time, not with anger, but with a heart seeking to understand. Claire wasn't the enemy. She was a part of Richard's life I'd never touched. And as I thought about it, my heart softened. I placed the scarf on the bench beside me, imagining Richard sitting there, looking at me with his familiar, quiet gaze. I whispered, "You could have told me. I wouldn't have left. I just wanted to know." A tear rolled down, not from anger, but from regret. I'd lost Richard twice, first when he died, and again when I learned of the man I never knew. But this time, I didn't want to hold on to the pain forever. I folded the letter, tucked it into my bag, and brought the scarf home, not as a relic of betrayal, but as the last trace of the man I loved, and a part of his soul I was just beginning to understand. The days that followed made the house feel too big, not because it had changed, but because I had. The walls, the door frames, even Richard's chair where he read the morning paper now carried echoes of a past that wasn't as whole as I'd thought. I spent more time in the backyard garden, where Richard had planted lavender for me because he knew I loved its scent. I'd sit there, sometimes just breathing, sometimes thinking about the man I loved and the woman he quietly cared for on the sidelines of our life together. I thought about Claire, no longer as a rival, but as an invisible companion, a woman who was also lonely, who also needed a shoulder, and who found it in the same man I did. I didn't hate her anymore. Maybe because on some level I understood why. Sometimes people don't seek romance to replace what they have. They seek someone to share the broken pieces they're afraid to bring home. One rare sunny winter morning, I wrapped Claire's scarf around my neck for the first time since receiving it. The soft wool brushed my skin like a reminder. A part of Richard lingered here. Not the part I knew, but still him. I couldn't deny that memory, just as I couldn't deny that he was a man of more layers than I'd imagined. I began sorting through old keepsake boxes, ones I'd ignored since the funeral. letters from when we first fell in love, birthday cards in his slanted handwriting, and a small notebook I'd never seen where Richard jotted down fleeting thoughts, notes about quiet days. One entry stopped me. Sometimes I want to tell her I'm lonely, but I'm afraid she'll think I don't love her anymore. The truth is, I do love her, just differently, and sometimes love isn't enough. I closed the notebook, tears streaming, but my heart lighter. I was beginning to understand. There were things we hadn't learned to share, not because we didn't love, but because we'd grown too comfortable with stability to risk stirring it with truth. After those quiet days, I started writing again. Not a diary or a letter, but fragments from myself. I wrote about our years together, the things Richard did for me that I hadn't appreciated until he was gone. I wrote about the pain of betrayal, but also about empathy and forgiveness, though not yet complete. I wrote about Claire, about the courage it took to send that letter. I realized that without it, I might have lived the rest of my life never knowing a part of Richard. And strangely, instead of making me hate him, it made him realer, closer, as if he too was flawed, human, yearning to be seen, like all of us. A week later, I decided to write to Claire, not to accuse or clarify, but to respond, because I knew the only thing worse than pain is unanswered silence. I wrote that I'd read her letter, that I'd been angry and hurt, but ultimately grateful. She'd given me a chance to see Richard from a new angle, to complete a picture I thought I'd finished long ago. I don't know if Claire will reply. I don't need her to. Writing that letter was like a closing ritual, not of my love for Richard, but of illusions that no longer fit. I loved him, and I still do. But now I love a fuller man, with all the parts he kept hidden. That spring came early. The lavender began greening again. I tended to it, and for the first time in months, my heart didn't feel so heavy. I no longer cried when I saw Richard's photo. Instead, I smiled faintly. I thought of our good memories and even the imperfect ones, and felt at ease. I'd lost Richard, but I'd found myself. A woman who loved, who was hurt, but who learned to forgive. Not just him, but herself. One April afternoon, I received a small envelope with no sender's name. Inside was a handwritten card with 4 words, "Thank you for understanding." No signature, but I knew it was Claire. That note closed the circle between us. 2 women once on opposite sides of pain, now able to understand and forgive. Not with long explanations, but with quiet respect. Life didn't change dramatically after that. I still lived in the old house, drank tea each morning, visited Richard's grave every weekend, but something inside me had softened. The bitterness had seeped into my heart, was replaced by gratitude for loving him and for learning to let go of what I couldn't change. I joined the town's book club, something I'd always declined because I was shy. I shared my story with a few new friends, not to vent, but because I knew others carried nameless wounds. We read together, laughed together, and sometimes sat in silence together. And that was enough to heal. Once, when Eleanor visited, she saw the scarf on the sofa. "You're still keeping this?" she asked. I nodded and said, "It reminds me that no one's perfect, but everyone deserves to be understood." She didn't press further, just sat beside me holding my hand tightly, and I knew, somehow, everything was whole. Looking back, I no longer see this story as a cut, but as a stitch. Painful, but healing in a deeper way. I loved an imperfect man, and through that love, I learned to love myself. With all my wounds, forgiveness, and peace. And maybe that's the real gift Richard left me, a heart that broke, but learned to beat to a new rhythm, gentle, honest, and free.